All right, so this video is going to give you some of the background for what Hume's getting into in the On Liberty and Necessity chapter. Basically, the free will debate, as it was in Hume's time. Now, the free will debate is often said to be this extremely old debate. Hume represented as being a 2,000-year-old debate, which pushes it back to the time of Plato and Aristotle, given that he was writing in the 1700s. And in a way, that's true. Plato mentions stuff that could be thought of as like an allusion to the free will issue. Aristotle does raise questions, both in his ethical works and in his works on physics, that do seem to be related to the free will issue. But the free will issue can't really get going in any substantial way until someone introduces the idea of determinism. Or I shouldn't say can't get going, but doesn't actually get going. It's determinism that for most people raises the clearest threat to our having free will, to our having control over our own behavior, to our doing what we do because of our own decisions and choices rather than outside powers. Okay. So what's determinism? And like, who came up with the idea? The earliest determinists were a group of Greek thinkers called atomists. Atomists thought, as the name suggests, that the universe is composed out of tiny little atoms, which just for them meant uncuttables, uncuttable objects, objects that couldn't be broken down into smaller objects, bouncing off each other, getting stuck to each other, things like that. Everything in the universe could be understood as these little balls with hooks. So like the early atomists thought it looked like this. Right? They thought atoms had little hooks, but besides that, they were like little balls. The hooks were necessary to explain how atoms locked onto each other because they thought atoms would come together. And of course, they didn't have any idea about subatomic particles or electrical charges or anything like that, so they couldn't make sense of how atoms bonded to one another except through this really straightforward physical way, or in terms of their shape. Okay, so you have atomists. They think the universe is, everything you observe in the universe is just the result of atoms bouncing around, getting stuck to each other, breaking apart, bouncing off each other, stuff like that. And they seem to think figuring out the behavior of atoms was really just like applying geometry to them. Right? So if you've ever played pool, like billiards, and you've done the calculation of like, if I hit this ball in this direction at this speed towards that surface, right, it's going to bounce precisely at this angle, right? So draw a little pool table. That's a terrible pool table. But let's say, you hit the cue ball hits another ball, and it bounces off. And the idea is you should be able to predict exactly how it moves because it's really just a matter of geometry. I had a teacher in high school try to convince us that geometry was worth knowing because it would make us better billiard players. And this was like the 1990s, and like video games were already a thing. So we were like, who plays billiards? But this is how the atomists thought of it. And some of them raised the following problem. Right? If everything in the universe, if every event in the universe, if every object in the universe is the way it is just because of atoms, bouncing off each other, moving through space in straight lines until they run into something else, in which case they either get stuck to it or they bounce off it, in these perfectly predictable ways, right? Where you have objects, you have the laws of geometry, and that's really it. Then, well, that means we're that way, right? Like if everything is made out of atoms, then we're made out of atoms. And if every event is just the result of atoms bouncing off each other in these completely predictable ways, then everything we do is just a result of atoms bouncing off each other in completely predictable ways. And that suggests that like there's nothing about us that determines it, right? If like our body is made out of trillions upon trillions upon trillions of atoms, and they're all just like bouncing around inside of us, and that's what causes everything in us to happen, then it seems like, well, we're not doing anything. We're just sort of along for the ride. We're aware of what's happening, but we're not causing what's happening, because what's causing everything we do is just the atoms bouncing off each other. Also, it seemed like if the atoms are completely predictable, then you could make a prediction about what someone was going to do completely accurately, like with all the precision and accuracy of basic mathematics, right? Because like for the ancient Greeks, physics was just a matter of applied geometry. I mean, people kind of thought that well into the modern period. It wasn't really until the scientific revolution got going that people stopped calling Euclid a physicist. Euclid's Elements being the great work of geometry from the ancient world. But if that's the case, if physics and the laws of motion are just like applied geometry, well, geometry's certain. You know, if you're given enough facts about something, you can figure out anything, right, in geometry, in ordinary Euclidean geometry. There's no like mysteries, there's no ambiguities. And so that seems like if you knew enough about the world, about where all the atoms were, how fast they were moving, what direction they were moving, right? Whether they were accelerating or decelerating, if you knew all this kind of information, then you could make absolutely 100% accurate predictions about anything in the future. The only barrier would be whether you can actually know that much about all the atoms. But then that means the only reason we can't predict each other's behavior is we just don't know enough about what's going on. But that seems to suggest that, like, before I was born, if somebody had known enough, like if God, looking down on the universe, whose mind is capable of knowing the location and the velocity of every atom in the universe, and knows everything that, you know, can be known about like when the atoms will stick together and stuff like that, God could make that prediction. Right? Or to put it, you know, in more secular and modern terms, a sufficiently powerful supercomputer could do that job. So the only barrier to prediction is computational capacity and information. It's not that there's something inherently unpredictable about us, right? Before we were ever born, if you had the computational power and the knowledge, you could predict everything we were ever going to do, which means it was already settled before we made any decisions what we were going to do. So we can define determinism then in the following way. Here's just an initial pass at it. At any given moment, there is only one physically possible future. Now, determinism is not the view that you can actually make these predictions. Sometimes people get confused about this. Determinism does not say you can actually predict human behavior, but it says that the reason why you can't predict human behavior is not that there's more than one possible way for someone to behave at any given time. It's just that no one has the computational power. No one has enough knowledge to make the prediction. It would involve knowing too much about too many things, and the calculations, well, like fundamentally all straightforward, there'd just be too many calculations to make in order to figure everything out. Okay. So determinism is not the view that everything can be predicted, but it is the view that there's only one possible way for things to go in the future. Another way of putting it is the state of the universe. And that would be all the facts about where every fundamental particle is, how it's moving, things like that. The state of the universe at any given time plus the laws of nature, the laws that describe how things behave in the universe. The state of the universe at any given time plus the laws of nature implies or entails every future state of the universe. So if you could tell 100 years ago where every particle in the universe was and you applied the laws of nature to it, determinism says that from that you could derive where everything in the universe would be today, which would mean you could have derived exactly what I'm doing right now, right? You could have derived that at 11:27 p.m. on the 10th of May, 2020, Dr. Mayer would be sitting in his basement, moving his hands just so. Right? And that can seem like a problem because, like I thought, anyway, I decided to do this not that long ago. Like I thought I decided to record these videos at around this time of night about an hour ago. Right? I was thinking like, well, I need to get this done and I'll have some time. So instead of playing video games, I'm gonna do that. And it felt like an hour ago, it was like perfectly possible for me to just like delay this, to not do it till tomorrow, the day after, or something like that. And seems like it's not true if determinism's true. 100 years ago, there was only one way things could turn out. And what determined the way things would turn out were facts that were true 100 years ago. Right? Where all the atoms and we would now say subatomic particles in the universe were and all the laws of nature and yada, yada, yada. That is what determined what I do right now. Okay. So that's the problem determinism poses for free will. Now, if you're familiar with contemporary science, especially contemporary quantum physics, you might be like, well, hold on, determinism doesn't sound like it's true. Hold on to that thought. Get to it later. Not in this video, in a later video. But for now, I want to go back to those ancient Greeks, the ancient atomists. But before I do, I'm going to rewrite this stuff because this is some sloppy handwriting. So be back in a flash. Rather than spend like 10 minutes trying to write that out by hand and pretend that the handwriting was good, I just typed it up. Okay, so that's determinism. The first people to sort of get this idea were the ancient Greek atomists. Now, some of the early atomists lived around the same time as Plato and Aristotle, but it wasn't really until a guy named Epicurus that this problem was seen to have like really impressive force. And Epicurus is a little bit after Plato and Aristotle. Now, the response that Epicurus gave to this problem that determinism seemed to pose to the idea that we control our behavior, that we can make things happen, that the future is not settled already, is the swerve. Oops. What's the swerve? Well, Epicurus said, occasionally atoms just do weird stuff. So you got an atom, right? Here's a little atom. It's too small for you to see the hooks. And it's moving in a straight line, as atoms tend to do, right? It bounced off something and it proceeded in a straight line from wherever it bounced off the thing. Well, Epicurus said from time to time, an atom that's moving in a straight line will just go swoop, swerve, go off, right? Random. And so he said, there, look, determinism is false. Nothing explains why the atom does the swerve. Just occasionally atoms do swerves. It's a thing atoms do. And this would be enough to show that determinism is false. However, not everybody was totally satisfied that this showed that we have control over our behavior. Because after all, if like the difference between determinism and what Epicurus said was true was that every once in a while, one of the atoms inside me just does something funky. Right? Like let's say there's an atom in my brain or a collection of atoms in my brain, even a molecule. Right? That just every once in a while just discharges some electrical energy randomly. Right? And that makes my hand go like, you might think like, well, that's not me controlling my behavior either, right? So this is the issue that Hume sort of inherits. It comes up again after the Middle Ages in a big way. Now, in the Middle Ages, people cared about free will, but they didn't care about free will because of determinism. They cared about free will because of the idea that God knew everything, and so God knew what we were going to do before we would do it. And this raised a problem for basically all monotheists, because the monotheistic religions seem to have in common that God rewards or punishes people for the stuff they do on earth after they die. But if God knew ahead of time what you were going to do and God made you so that you would do it, it seemed like not fair that God was punishing you for doing the thing that God knew ahead of time you were going to do, right? And that God like made you so that you would do. And so that's the context in which free will, debates about free will and our control over our own behavior came up in the Middle Ages. And the reason why is atomism went away. Aristotle didn't like atomism. Plato actually was kind of an atomist. To my knowledge, Plato never engaged with this issue directly. But Plato, in a dialogue called the Timaeus, has an atomistic theory of nature that he lays out, where he tries to like say which features of atoms lead to which observable macro level kinds of phenomena. It's pretty clever. It's the first time anybody ever tried to do that. But Plato doesn't get into the free will issue there. He only ever gestures at it in dialogues like the Phaedo. So Aristotle, though, didn't like atomism. Atomism said there were atoms moving through empty space, and Aristotle didn't think there was any such thing as empty space. He was like, no, there's no such thing as vacuums. And then it makes sense. And so, because in the Middle Ages, everybody was either working from Plato, who just didn't raise the worry, or from Aristotle, who was like, well, atomism ain't true. Because of that, determinism wasn't a big issue during the Middle Ages. But after the Renaissance, when people started rediscovering, or people in Western Europe anyway, started rediscovering all this stuff that had been written long before, a lot of early scientists, people like Galileo, basically just became atomists. They didn't call it atomism. They called it corpuscularianism. Terrible word. But they adopted basically the same position, which meant that the issue was now coming back again. And you can see in Descartes that the issue is already there. Or rather, you can see in Descartes a concern to defend freedom of the will. And Descartes was aware of the threat posed by determinism to freedom of the will. And while he doesn't focus on it much in the Meditations, Descartes does work on this. But the basic history of the modern period after Descartes is a lot of the people influenced by Descartes just ended up deciding that like free will didn't exist, didn't really make much sense. Why? Well, because if it was going to be possible to figure out using reason alone all the major facts about the universe, and if facts that you know through reason alone or a priori were going to be necessarily true, then there was a lot of pressure to just say everything that was true was necessarily true, like everything that happened had to happen. And so there were a lot of people following Descartes, a lot of rationalists following Descartes, who ended up just giving up on the idea of freedom of the will. Or if they believed in freedom of the will, they didn't really have a very compelling idea about like how it could be that we're free. The most famous person following Descartes who did this was a guy named Baruch Spinoza, or Benedict Spinoza. You see his name spelled different ways depending on whether you go with the Jewish version of his name, which is correct because he was Jewish, or the Spanish version of his name. Anyway, a lot of people following Descartes ended up just giving up on free will in favor of determinism. A lot of people who didn't follow Descartes, a lot of empiricists, though, were like, well, no, we can have free will. Things happen, but, you know, it's not like they had to happen. If you were an empiricist, you weren't stuck thinking that everything that happened was necessary, or there was no pressure on you to do that, because the idea everybody had was that necessity, right? Necessary truth went along with things being a priori, right? So that if you knew something a priori, it was necessary. But if you didn't think most things were known a priori, well, then that removed the idea that everything had to be necessarily true. You could just say, well, it's true, but it's not necessarily true. And for a lot of empiricists, and this is empiricists before Hume, that's part of how they explained why you couldn't know so many things a priori. Right? They'd say, look, it happened, like some event happened, like say you're talking about the English Civil War, something that a lot of empiricists, because a lot of the empiricists were English, were concerned with. If you were to explain the English Civil War, which is a war that happened in the mid-1600s, if you were an empiricist, you were probably going to say, well, that was a contingent thing. It happened, but it didn't have to happen. And given that it happened, but it didn't have to happen, that makes it basically impossible to know just by thinking about it why it happened, right? A lot of weird random stuff occurred that caused it to happen. So a lot of empiricists were intrigued by the idea that there's just a lot of contingency in the world, right? The opposite of necessity. And so determinism just wasn't true. Right? Then came Newton. And Newton's laws of motion, whatever else they were, did seem to be deterministic. Right? They did seem to sort of get us back to that idea that the early atomists had, that the motion, the behavior of everything in the universe was the result of some rather simple quantitative laws of physics. And you could figure out why everything moved and did what it did on that basis. People began comparing everything in the world to kind of like a machine. Right? And the idea was, well, you can predict what a machine will do. A machine has precision. A machine will do exactly the thing you built it to do. And Newton inspired this, which brought the whole free will issue back up again. So this is the context in which Hume is writing. There are a lot of people who, prior to Hume, denied that free will existed. There are a lot of people who claim that we had free will, but we could only have free will because there was random stuff going on. And there were some people who were trying to say, well, everything that happens is necessary, but nonetheless, we still have free will, but they couldn't quite convince anybody of it. It was really hard to do. This is the context in which Hume is writing. Hume wants to settle the free will issue forever, and he thinks he can do it. And his account of causation is going to play a big role in how he does it. And what Hume is going to do is he's basically going to end up saying determinism, or what he calls necessity. So in the liberty and necessity, necessity basically refers to determinism. The way people like in Hume's time would have described it is as a conjunction of two claims. Everything has a cause, or every event has a cause anyway, and causes necessitate their effects. And the idea was those two things together implied determinism. Hume is going to say, yes, everything has a cause and causes necessitate their effects, but we still have freedom, or liberty, as he puts it. And he's going to actually try to argue not just that this is true, but that everybody basically believes it's true. And the only thing that has stopped everyone from realizing they all agree that determinism is true, but nonetheless we still have free will, or liberty, is that people haven't understood the terms they've been using properly. But luckily, Hume is here to rescue them with his account of causation. So in the next video, I'll get to how Hume thinks he pulls off this kind of impressive achievement that he thinks